Coming up, some potential bad news for Florida, possible good news for Georgia, and we'll react to the big news at Auburn. It's all on the way next, right here on SEC Country Live. Hello, everybody. Welcome into SEC Country Live. My name is Brandon Adams. Glad to have you with us. Hopefully by now this has become an appointment for you. We are back doing this show each and every week, 3 p.m. on Wednesdays. SEC Country Live. A lot for you on today's show. It's Stephen Lassen from Athlon Sports coming up. Many of you know that I have long been a fan of the college football preview magazines. Even in this internet age we live in, and we're actually kind of post-internet now, more social media type age, where everything is kind of digital, in your hand, on your phone. I still love the old school magazines. I love reading them at the pool or, kind of whatever your summer activity is, taking those magazines with you wherever you go. Athlon, one of my favorite. The editor who puts it all together, Stephen Lassen from Athlon Sports, going to be with us a little bit later on. We'll talk to him about everything going on around the SEC. Good preview of that magazine. We'll look forward to doing that there at that time here coming up in a couple of minutes. Before that, though, I do want to go above the fold with the big story around the SEC. And I actually want to begin with the Florida Gators here today because I saw something on social media that got my attention that it turns out might not be as bad as it initially appeared, and yet I still think it leads to a pretty phenomenal conversation about what exactly needs to have in Gainesville for the Florida Gators here this year. So let me kind of walk you through all of this. Matt Hayes, of course, really good, longtime college football reporter, now doing sports radio down in Jacksonville. He put up some season win totals on his Twitter feed, and for those of you that don't follow gambling closely, what a win total is, it's an over-under for expected wins during the regular season. You can bet that any team will go above that number or go over or go under that, meaning they'll win less than these games. And he shares with you on the Bet Online numbers for the upcoming year. Most of the stuff you see there about what you'd kind of expect to see, in line with most of the other numbers around college football and the other betting houses who've shared their data, except down at the bottom. You see the number next to the Florida Gators name? A year removed from winning the SEC East, the Florida Gator number just 7 for this year. Now, as it turns out, Matt, like we all do from time to time, I get fat thumbs or whatever else and just push the wrong button. The actual truth is, according to Bet Online, and we can confirm this for you, that the actual Florida number is not 7. The actual Florida number for the upcoming year is actually 9. So from that respect, it sort of seems better, right? And if you want an even more positive spin on all of this, for those of you that follow gambling, you'll understand this. If you see there, according to Bet Online, the juice on this is actually on the over. So it's an over-under of 9, but it's a little more expensive. That's the minus number. That means it's the favorite. A little more expensive to bet the over on the 9 than it is the under. So if you want a positive spin on that for Florida related to the gambling stuff, that's obviously an example of that. So with all of that said, let me just kind of bring this to mind for you. Is this really what Florida should be a year removed from winning the SEC East, a year removed from the buzz that was generated by beating Georgia and Jacksonville and getting to the SEC championship game, and at least on the offensive side of the ball, really kind of trading blow for blow with Alabama for most of that game, settling for a regular season 9-3 campaign? Is that what Florida fans should be happy with? Another year into the Dan Mullen era. He's been there now since 2018. Is that really supposed to be good enough, especially given the praise that Mullen and his coaching staff continue to have heaped on them? Michael Bratton's a guy that writes for Saturday Down South. He was making a podcast appearance recently, and he was talking about his top coordinators in the SEC, and he likes the play calling combo of Dan Mullen at Florida and Todd Grantham on the defense about as much as anybody in the SEC. In fact, I think he had him rated, third of all SEC coordinators. In fact, I think we can show this to you, of the coordinators in the SEC and what Michael Bratton from Saturday Down South had kind of said about that. Yeah, I mean, he's got, Florida just behind, which is kind of interesting, Arkansas and Mississippi State. So maybe there's not a huge correlation to winning related to all of this, but that's some of the love that you sometimes see for a Dan Mullen, Todd Grantham. These are great coaches. These are coaches that do more with less. These are guys that are going to, coach up your team. And yet the season win total, according to Bet Online, according to some of the other betting houses that have weighed in on this, is just 9 here for this upcoming year. And you may be saying, well, BA, what do you expect? What do you want to hear said about Florida? Well, I'm not a Florida fan. I don't really want to hear anything necessarily good said about Florida, but I do think it's really instructive to pay attention to just how different the conversation is around Florida compared to what it was a year ago. And in fact, I think I've got something I can share with you here. I went back to last year listening to big names from the college football media and all the discussion that was going on about Florida ahead of the upcoming season back in 2020, way back then. Went back and discussed all of that a year ago and listened to the way in which, this is not fall stuff. This was stuff that was happening in the spring of 2020, the early summer stages of 2020. This is some of the stuff that was being said. Go back and listen to the guys like, Jordan Rodgers and Chris Doering and Danny Cannell and some of these voices, and look around to see, are you really hearing much of that at all right now for this offseason? Here's a reminder from just last spring.
I think Florida's definitely a contender this year.
The Florida Gators are the team to beat in the SEC East.
I look at Florida and I go, it's got to be now.
Kyle Trask, possibly the best quarterback in the league.
They've got an outstanding quarterback in Kyle Trask, who not enough people talked about this past season and the success he had with Dan Mullen.
This has got to be Florida's year because of Kyle Trask, his development.
The defense is going to be stout, particularly in the secondary.
Florida's going to be better defensively. They have one of the best defensive coordinators in the country.
I think Florida's in a prime position to get back to Atlanta in 2020.
So that's the stuff that you were hearing a year ago about Florida. But if you really look around, you're not hearing those kinds of things right now at all. Betting houses saying, we got you about 9-3, which means you're trying to get to the postseason, trying to avoid having a 4-loss season for the second consecutive year. And if you really kind of try to wrestle with this and say, well, why are the expectations so low for a coach in Dan Mullen who's supposed to be so smart, and for all the transfers that Florida's supposed to have brought in? Why is the conversation around Florida right now so different? I think a lot of this centers around the quarterback position. And in the montage you just heard a moment ago, a lot of praise for Kyle Trask. A lot of folks who felt like that Trask, based on what he had done when he had a chance to play in 2019, was set up to do well for Florida in 2020. And for the most part, those predictions turned out to be true. He faltered a little bit towards the end of the year, but for the most part, Kyle Trask had a really good year. And yet Dan Mullen, in his own words, told us at the end of his spring practice that his quarterback situation right now is at least not quite as settled as it was a year ago, so much so that Dan Mullen right now is trying to figure out if he has 2 quarterbacks he could potentially turn to. And of course, the cliche in all of this, if you have 2 quarterbacks, do you really have one? Well, Dan Mullen's not quite sure of either of those answers right now. This is a reminder from Mullen this past spring.
You know what? It's so hard for me because I don't even think in those terms right now, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, you would have to say yes, but I would say, I'll give you an honest answer. So I would say yes, but I don't think of it in terms like that because, I'm so much in, you got to prepare at least 2 quarterbacks ready to go. Does that make sense? So, my thought process is, okay, we're going to have, how are we getting 2 starters ready? And then we're going to be young after, we have the 2 young guys. So then what's the backup plan after we have 2 starters? Does that kind of make sense? I don't know if I'm explaining it the right way, but in my mind, that makes sense. You know what I mean? So it's instead of, hey, Emery's the starter, you're the backup, we need 2 starters, and then I got to figure out the backup situation beyond that.
I would say that sounds like a coach that's not quite so sure what he has at quarterback right now. And that may be one of the reasons that folks in Las Vegas, the online betting houses, even the media that seemed to love Florida a year ago, aren't quite so sure what the Gators bring to the table here this season as well. It's SEC Country Live. We'll continue to go above the fold here with the big news around the SEC. The Gators' chief rival in the SEC East right now is Georgia. That's the team that'll be prohibitively picked to go out there and win that division here in 2021. But there are also some unanswered questions for Georgia to deal with right now as well. They are unsettled and inexperienced at cornerback, but the possibility exists that Georgia may still look to use the transfer portal to its advantage to help solve that problem before the year is done. Georgia's already brought in Brandon Turnage, a talented but inexperienced player from Alabama, and of course Tyke Smith, a former All-American level player at West Virginia, but still the need exists potentially for Georgia to have a guy who could start at cornerback and play at a high level, which brings you back to the discussion of Darian Kendrick, former All-ACC performer at Clemson, who is commonly mentioned as a potential first-round pick in the 2022 NFL Draft and looking for a new home upon, as it's been described by Dabo Swinney, mutually parting ways there with the Clemson program. Well, Dog Nation's Mike Griffith, who covers UGA on a regular basis, says the new home for Darian Kendrick might very well end up being UGA if some issues can be cleared up that Kendrick's currently dealing with. This is Mike Griffith on that topic.
There's a lot of optimism out of the Kendrick camp, and he's leaning George's way, and misdemeanor charge for having a gun sitting in his lap while he was sleeping in a car, and small amount of marijuana, that was a citation. That's what happened back March 12th. He had already been dismissed from the Clemson football team. Again, this hasn't happened yet. I want to be clear on this. George is positioned to get Kendrick, provided that things get taken care of in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and this kid gets a second chance.
So he says if Darian Kendrick can deal with some legal issues he's dealing with, including a weapons charge, then the door could be open for Kendrick to come to UGA. There has been some reporting that suggests that Kendrick might have a path to clearance on this legal issue with those criminal charges that he's dealing with. Either way, Darian Kendrick made a recent podcast appearance with JB and Skiggy, guys that he grew up with and knew. He talked about some of the, at least from the perspective of others, outside opinions, what has been described as character concerns for him, what he knows about his own situation that maybe other people don't quite understand. This is Darian Kendrick telling his own story in his own words on this topic as he looks to work his way back into the college football world again. Here is Darian Kendrick.
My son had some problems going on, so I was with him. I wasn't really at school. It was like during springtime, so I had a lot going on then. So I was with him. Then wasn't really doing work. Couldn't really do work because I was always in the hospital. They had going to the hospital back and forth. So that's one thing. And then having them, and then having, you feel me, all this extra going around in my city where I have to come back to see them. Like, everybody got to protect themselves. Like, it ain't nothing against nobody. Like, everybody got to protect themselves. You don't know what's gonna happen at what time. I don't care who you is, what your name is. None of that. Like, you can be the smallest person in the city, nobody knows you, something can still happen to you. So it's always, you got to be aware of your surroundings, of what's going on around you. It's not really trying to, you feel me, like trying to act somebody unite. It's just, you got something to live for.
So interesting perspective there from Darian Kendrick in his own words, saying there are aspects of his own situation of why he left Clemson and what he wishes would have been different about his relationship with Dabo Swinney, or what led to him, dealing with some criminal charges there in South Carolina. From his perspective, Kendrick would say, there are things I know about this that other people don't know. We'll see how that works its way out and solves itself as we head towards the future. But obviously one of the big unanswered questions in the remainder of the offseason, where some of these big-name transfers, including Darian Kendrick, former Clemson cornerback, where he lands. We'll also talk to you about this in our comment section on both our SEC Country Facebook and SEC Country Live YouTube pages. We'll give you a chance to react to all this. But for now, as promised, I love the Athlon Sports College Football Preview magazine. It is on its way to newsstands. It's about to be one of those things that keeps people like me company for the rest of the summer as we're reading this by pools and everything else. And the editor who helps put it all together is Stephen Lassen from Athlon Sports. He joins us here today on SEC Country Live. Steve, congratulations on getting a new another magazine there to the printer, and welcome here to SEC Country Live. We appreciate you being with us here today.
Hey, Brandon, it's always good to talk to you, and it's always great to be talking to you. And the magazine is on the newsstand. It's for sale on our site as well. And especially, we went through so much last season, so much uncertainty. There's no doubt about it this year. We are looking forward to a normal and complete college football season. So it's exciting times for those of us that are college football fans.
And, of course, magazines like this always generate a lot of buzz, whether it be the opinions and how certain teams or players get ranked, or, the anonymous coaches that get quoted in magazines such as this. You've seen the magazine. I actually haven't seen it yet. I am looking forward to getting my copy and reading it. But what is your early sense of kind of what from the magazine is seemingly generating the most buzz right now?
I think the biggest thing is right at the top. We have Alabama projected number 1, and Georgia fans, certainly we have them projected just outside the college football playoff at number 5. There's a lot of buzz about that prediction, and from Georgia fans, whether or not they should be in the playoff. But also it was a pretty debate in our preseason prediction meetings as to how to rank those top 2 teams in the SEC. And I think, of course, too, once you kind of look at the SEC pecking order, I think there's some debates in there that I think a lot of people are going to be talking about. Missouri versus Kentucky. Mm-hmm. You look over in the SEC West, what do we think about LSU? They're the biggest wild card in the SEC, and Texas A&M. How high do you rank them? So I think the top of the SEC is pretty clear this year, but I also think once you get past that, there's some debates there that I think you can get a lot of disagreement on.
Well, I want to get more into the SEC West thing in a moment because I do think that's a fascinating division this year. I would suggest probably the best and most interesting in all of college football. But you mentioned, George, I want to ask you about JT Daniels because something I have seen recently from Athlon Sports is the preseason All-SEC list. This is obviously online, athlonsports.com. You guys have 4 teams on there, and Matt Corral was your first-team All-SEC quarterback, which certainly makes some sense. We've had analytics experts, things like that on this show who've also touted Corral to have a big season, and then Bryce Young from Alabama as the second-team All-SEC quarterback. And once again, that makes sense, too, just given how prolific Alabama quarterbacks have been in recent years, even if Young isn't quite so experienced. Then it's JT Daniels, who I believe you guys had as the number 3 quarterback there, and that, to me, is the recipe. You guys say, hey, Georgia just below Alabama, maybe just outside that college football playoff conversation, or just creeping in. I mean, to me, a lot of that for Georgia centers on, can Daniels exceed the play of a guy like Matt Corral at Ole Miss? Can he exceed the play of a new starter, Bryce Young, in a place like Alabama? Can JT Daniels play like the best quarterback in the SEC? Because that's what it's taken to win the national championship in the last 2 years, and big-time, quarterback play has obviously been a part of national championships for, years going on that. So, to me, a lot of this for Georgia centers around what happens with Daniels, who I guess Athlon sees as third-best quarterback in the SEC. What would you put on JT's shoulders in terms of getting the Georgia offense to where it needs to go for the season if it wants to match what teams like LSU and Alabama have done in recent seasons?
Yeah, no question about it. We've seen that difference makers at quarterback drive college football now. Joe Burrow was the reason that LSU perked up and won the national championship, was able to unseat Alabama. Look what's gone on at Alabama. I mean, Tua, Mac Jones. There's an offensive, kind of revolution underway in the SEC. It's no longer just about having a good defense and running game. You have to have a difference maker at the quarterback position. I think JT Daniels can be that guy. You mentioned our All-SEC teams, and I think this was a fascinating debate in our, kind of staff meetings. We think that there are 3 top kind of 8 quarterbacks in the SEC. So these are the elite guys in the country. We think Bryce Young, we think JT Daniels, we think Matt Corral are all going to be in the mix to kind of be a 3rd, 4th team All-America. So when we say 2nd or 3rd team All-SEC, we're talking about the best of the best in college football. And so we're projecting both Bryce Young and JT Daniels to have that type of season. But when you look back at last year, JT Daniels in his starts, Georgia averaged just over a touchdown more a game than they did with anyone else under center. So his impact was clear, and it's not just the scoreboard, it's how different he can make this offense. He can push the ball down the field, averaging over 10 yards per attempt. Those are all kind of things that Georgia has to get out of its quarterback position, and I think he can be that guy, and I also think what helps him is the playmakers around him at receiver. Yes, George Pickens is injured and out indefinitely, but I really like guys like Darnell Washington, Jermaine Burton. You throw in Arian Smith and some of the other guys, that receiving core for Georgia is loaded. So I think everything is really in place for this offense to take off, especially, too, they have a full offseason to work under Todd Monken, and I think we'll see kind of the benefit of all of that this year.
I want to ask about the SEC East again before we're done. Let me squeeze this on the SEC West before we get there. You guys mentioned your opinion of Alabama, and it's obviously high, as every one of these preseason magazines will be. And yet I do find the SEC West to be fascinating. I expect LSU to have a bounce-back season this year. That's still a very talented roster. Obviously trying to figure out who its starting quarterback is going to be, but no doubt that's a talented roster that could certainly exceed the performance of what happened in 2020. But it's really Texas A&M that I do find the most fascinating. People give me grief all the time because I have been touting in this offseason the chances that A&M really can be a true, legit threat to Alabama. I'm not quite ready to say yet that I think A&M wins this division the way that LSU did in 2019 or Auburn did in 2017. But, boy, I'm watching it closely because people forget that Jimbo Fisher has a national championship on his resume. There aren't very many active coaches who can say that. And obviously, the improved play from the Aggies a year ago, how close is a Texas A&M or an LSU, if you want to include that, to an Alabama in your evaluation of the SEC West at the moment?
I think there's still a gap there. I think A&M has closed it a little bit, and I think just finishing outside the college football playoff last year certainly kind of shows just how far this team has progressed. But I think if we talk about Georgia and the quarterback position, I think that's kind of where this goes to me for Texas A&M. The uncertainty at quarterback, whether it's Haynes King, Zach Calzada, whichever one of those two wins that battle needs to be a difference maker at the position. Jimbo knows quarterbacks. He's going to get good quarterback play. But in order to beat Alabama, they are going to have to get elite play at that position. I'm a little skeptical they can do that this year. And also the offensive line, which was so good last season, 4 new starters this year. I think that's just too much uncertainty and new faces coming in on offense to win this year. I do love their defense, though. 9 starters back from a group that gave up only 21 points a game last year. So I think A&M is very much a top 10 team. I think in order to close that gap another step forward, they need that quarterback to emerge. We don't think that they get there this year, but I think they continue to cut into that gap and finish in the top 10 once again.
All right, let me finish with this. Before you joined us off the top of our show, I kind of played a little bit of a montage of media opinions on Florida from a year ago. Heaping praise on Kyle Trask. Obviously, it turned out to be a correct opinion. Heaping praise on Florida, predicting them win the SEC East. That also turned out to be a correct opinion as well. But by contrast, you don't hear that kind of stuff this offseason. Does that mean in your mind that Florida's a sleeper team and still dangerous in the SEC East? Or do you think the media is ignoring the Gators with good reason as we head towards 2021?
Yeah, that's a great question because, when we did our predictions, we certainly vetted them and discussed Florida for number 1. But I feel Georgia is a pretty clear-cut favorite in this division. I think it's fair to probably call them a sleeper only because, if things fall into place, I just think their offense is going to be fine. Emory Jones and all the running backs they have, they'll piece it together. But it's just hard for me to see Florida cutting into that gap to Georgia when you have to play Alabama, you have to play at LSU, and the defense last year, which just struggled in every facet. So I think Florida is a good sleeper kind of in name value because, they could win the SEC East. I just think there's just the gap to Georgia this year with the personnel that Georgia has coming back. I just think it's pretty steep for Florida based upon schedule and personnel.
All right, Stephen Lassen, Athlon Sports, thank you so much for being with us. Hey, remind us one more time, though, if people want to find the magazine themselves, how they can do that, or the other great content you guys are doing at Athlon Sports online at athlonsports.com throughout the year.
Absolutely. So the magazine is on newsstands right now, and if you want to get a magazine, you can also go to our website, athlonsports.com. Our online store has all of our covers, and we'll ship them out to you. And we have college football content every day of the year, and definitely looking forward to counting down to the start of the season.
Stephen, I'd love to have you back on when I have a chance to read more of the magazine. We'll react to some of the stuff that's in there as well. But thanks for setting the stage for what's going to be a fun off-season of conversations we had through the summer. We'll look forward to getting a chance to speak to you soon.
Absolutely. Look forward to it. Thanks again for having me on.
Good stuff there. Stephen Lassen from Athlon Sports here on SEC Country Live. We're going to talk about some of the other SEC news here in just a little bit. I do want to give you, though, a chance to react to some of the stuff that Stephen had to say or some of the stuff that I had to say off the top of the program here today. We take a lot of comments on the show, both on YouTube and Facebook, so we'll look forward to doing that right now and then get back to the other big news after that. By the way, good to see Cliff Nelson in our comment section. Always a great commenter from our LSU side of things, representing the state of Louisiana. Cliff weighs in to say that you better discount LSU at your own peril. I'll take the quarterback room at LSU over A&M and Alabama. That is a very interesting opinion. Notice he says quarterback room, not necessarily settling on one name. And I would be kind of curious about this because we have a lot of, if you're a fan of an SEC team and you're commenting on a show like this, you know your team pretty well. And generally speaking, while I kind of value my own opinion, obviously who wouldn't, that guy like Cliff, who's like really kind of locked in on LSU and paying close attention, the guy that as a fan, because he's got some emotional investment in this, the guy that he wants to see start would matter to me. And I haven't heard enough from LSU fans about whether you want it to be Brennan, you want it to be, a Max Johnson. My assumption is that a lot of Georgia fans, LSU fans have kind of settled on Max Johnson on this. That's kind of my assumption, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But Cliff says, give me that quarterback room. I'll take the collection of LSU quarterbacks, and obviously he's counting, the incoming freshman Garrett Nussmeier in that as well. Give me that collection of quarterbacks in comparison to what Alabama has, in addition to Bryce Young, or what Texas A&M has between, Hayes King and Zach Calzada. I think that's a pretty interesting way to look at all that. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but I certainly understand where you're coming from. And with Jake Peets as the new play caller there, the new offensive coordinator, if you can find that magic with Johnson, that magic with Brennan potentially. I don't think at this stage of his career Nussmeier's probably ready to do that yet. But obviously if you can find that more high-powered offense, not have to be as good as Joe Burrow was in 2019. Not sure anybody will be again. But if you can find some level of offensive competency, all of a sudden it does make the SEC West more difficult to win. Let me get a few more YouTube comments there as well. By the way, Cliff also says that he thinks that Brennan is the better thrower, which is kind of an interesting comparison to all of that too. As I said before, it does matter to me what fans of their school think, because they got the emotional investment in it. G. Greg's Bama boy also bringing up another quarterback from the state of Louisiana, Arch Manning, for a moment. I think it's going to be really interesting as we head towards the class of 2023, which is obviously the Manning class. For those of you that are not fully acquainted, Arch Manning is the son of Cooper Manning, the brother of Peyton and Eli, and obviously that makes Arch Manning a grandson to the former New Orleans Saint Ole Miss quarterback Archie Manning. Here's the thing. It's going to be very difficult for us to know how much of the attention paid to Manning is real because he really is the best prospect in the country, or there's a natural business-related incentive to make Arch Manning your number one prospect because it's his famous last name. Typically speaking, recruiting content is a little bit of a niche product. And anytime you can make recruiting coverage a little bit more mainstream, you obviously get new eyeballs onto that, making Arch Manning your number one player in the country, which a lot of outlets, as we kind of head into the 2023 cycle, are going to be tempted to do, and keep him there. It's going to be difficult to kind of separate that. Is this the real deal, best quarterback in the country, the same way we've talked about guys in the past, or is this a guy who's kind of getting some of that love? ESPN, for instance, has written a lot about Arch Manning, and they're a little bit of a drive-by, media outlet when it comes to, recruiting coverage. That kind of gives you an idea of what the Arch Manning scene is going to be like as we head towards 2023 there. Teresa Pope checking in from White House, Tennessee. Teresa, thank you for being a part of what we're doing here today. I really appreciate that. Great to have you here. Mark Morris says that his number 2 SEC West pick is LSU. He says he thinks that Max Johnson will be the starter. Mark also had a good comment a little earlier that I saw in the YouTube comment section, which I thought was very interesting and well said, that part of the reason it may be quiet around the Florida program right now is Dan Mullen had a handful of comments last season that weren't particularly well received, including after the bowl game when he essentially disregarded the bowl loss to Oklahoma, that maybe there was a suggestion that maybe he cool it with his own talk a little bit, that he not say very much, not do much to generate attention, because most of the attention that has been generated around Florida and the buzz that Mullen has created has for the most part been negative for a while. I think that's actually an interesting point from Mark Pope on all of that. Let me get a few more Facebook comments here for a moment, and then we'll get back to our All Points Bulletin and talk about the news of the day around the rest of the SEC. Good to see Tennille Calvino checking in. Moose Thames noticing all of our SEC helmets behind us here. That's part of our setup here at SEC Country Live. Always a fun thing to be able to do. And, you got Alabama and Florida right now sitting on that top shelf because those were the two teams that played in the SEC championship game. We'll start to move those around a little bit once we head towards the season, and we'll start to kind of match up the teams that are playing. But for now, we're going to kind of go with that. That's kind of always been our thing we kind of do here a little bit. Joey Stewart says, going back to some disappointment potentially for Florida, he says, let me guess, I'm assuming Joey must be a Florida fan. Media picks the Dogs again. He says, keep picking those Dogs. They always come up short, 41 years and counting. So Joey weighing in pretty heavy on all of that. Charlie Adams also checks in to say that 9 wins has to be about right for Florida as an over-under. 10 wins would mean losses to Georgia and Bama and winning the rest of the games. Yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting way to look at that from Charlie. if you're Florida, let's say you do go 10-2, you'd take a loss to Alabama in all likelihood. Florida's about a 2-touchdown underdog in that game, even though it's in Gainesville, and about a touchdown underdog or slightly more against Georgia for the game there in October in Jacksonville. But one of the things that we talked about, I think we talked about this show last week, do you really feel confident for Florida on the road in Baton Rouge here for this upcoming year? I'm not quite so sure I could buy into that right now, but Charlie does bring a kind of interesting perspective to this. That if you did go 10-2, which would include a win against LSU, if your only two losses were to Alabama and Georgia, maybe from that standpoint, it's not such a bad season for Florida. This is a more difficult schedule than we've sometimes seen the Gators play because their two SEC West matchups this year are both Alabama and LSU. That's a fairly good point. Lawrence Rosenbluth says that Ole Miss could be the heartbreaker this year. And I think that Lawrence brings up an interesting point there, and it does set the stage for, as we were talking to Stephen Last a moment ago, the SEC West to me is fascinating. And it's not just because of the top-end teams. And I would say that the three top-end teams are LSU, who we've discussed in our comment section here, obviously A&M, who you heard Stephen weigh in about a moment ago, and Alabama, who's, still the clear favorite in the division, even though the division itself is pretty deep. What about those other four teams? What about Sam Pittman moving into a year two after a year one that was much better than folks would have thought? What about Ole Miss and Lawrence's point here that led by Lane Kiffin, playing close with Alabama a year ago? What about Ole Miss, one of those teams that has the potential to be a heartbreaker for somebody else? I have told you before, some of you seem to like Kiffin as a transformational coach more so than I do. He's clearly a dynamic figure. Media certainly just eats up everything that he says. Generating attention is something that he's been good at for a long time. But when it comes to that actual ability to build something permanent, something that lasts, it seems like to me Lane Kiffin's ability to generate headlines off the field has always been more substantial than his ability to generate those headlines on the field. But really good comments here and having a really good time. Deontay Julian also checking in there as well. So it's good to see those comments kind of rolling through here. We'll continue to take those on SEC Country Live here today. Let me move on for now, though. Let's do our all points bulletin and check on the other big news around the SEC. And there is big news coming out of Auburn right now, as Auburn welcomes in former LSU quarterback T.J. Finley, who has transferred now to Auburn. And Finley recently spoke out with Jordy Culletta, who's a media figure around the state of Louisiana, covered LSU for a long time, so has a relationship apparently with Finley because of that. Finley talking about what it was he likes about his chance to move on to Auburn, what it is that he's looking to do, and making no bones about the fact that by going to Auburn, even though there's an entrenched starter in place in Bo Nix, Finley is looking for that early playing time. This is T.J. Finley, the former LSU quarterback, on with Jordy Culletta from his YouTube show based out of Louisiana.
You also mentioned that immediate playing time was very important to you. What type of opportunity do you expect in year one under the new coaching staff?
I'm just coming in, doing my job. First of all, I need to learn the playbook. I can't play if I don't know the playbook.
Sure.
I'm going in to learn the playbook, and then, when the opportunity presents itself, I'll be ready.
So he says he's going there to learn the playbook. When the opportunity presents itself, he's going to be ready. The other thing that Finley did not mince words about on with Jordy Culletta is in looking at his transfer opportunity, even though it was kind of reported that he was considering, Penn State and Texas to go along with Alabama and Auburn, the fact of the matter is staying in the SEC is something that T.J. Finley said he definitely wanted to do. More from Finley on that.
I'm going to be honest. I never wanted to leave the SEC because I know the SEC will get me prepared to play in the NFL, regards to coverages and things of that nature. So I really wanted to stay in the SEC, so that's what I did.
So if you were ever wondering, is this a real quarterback competition or not, is Finley being brought in with a chance to win the job? I think the actions of Bo Nix, the current Auburn starter on social media, give you an idea that, no, this is probably a real competition. This is about to go down here because Nix doing like what so many quarterbacks do, making sure to present the public image of being very happy to see Finley at LSU. In fact, this was kind of captured from Bo Nix's Instagram story, kind of a welcoming in of T.J. Finley to LSU. Let me show you this on the screen here. This is kind of the thing that sort of classically happens when you're talking about these quarterback competitions. Josh Fatale sharing this on Twitter, that Bo Nix gives you the welcome to the fam look there with T.J. Finley as he's coming in. So Nix making making it very apparent on social media that he views TJ Finley as being part of his family, even though they're about to engage in a competition. Auburn coach Brian Harsin has been speaking at some of these like rubber chicken circuit, kind of, what do you call them, like booster club type deals as of late. He has not shied away from saying this is going to be a competition. He's also been careful not to kind of, say anything that kind of buries Bo Nix here, because Nix, in addition to being, as I said before, the entrenched starter at Auburn, he also has a little bit of, kind of political power behind his name there as well, because his dad was also a quarterback at Auburn. This was a big-time recruit when Gus Malzahn brought him into the program. So it is a little bit more difficult, possibly, to move a guy like Nix out of that starting role than it might be some other quarterbacks, just given the heft that kind of exists around Nick's name. But when I say more difficult, I don't mean impossible. And this is one of those things, if you're an Auburn fan, and obviously we have a lot of Auburn fans who are watching us right now, if you're an Auburn fan, this may be one of those moments where you're actually glad to have a new head coach in place, because I mentioned before, it's not easy to move an entrenched starter out anyway. It's more difficult when that guy also kind of has deep connections to your program that exist, for many years into the past. But it's much easier to do that if it's not the head coach that recruited him into the program who's making that decision. If it's Gus Malzahn, who's still the coach on the Plains, all of a sudden for Malzahn, especially given what Malzahn has said about Nix in the past, it's actually pretty difficult for a guy like Gus Malzahn to move Nix out of there, to make room for a guy like TJ Finley. But Brian Harsin, who has no emotional ties to anyone here, who didn't recruit Nix, and not necessarily going to view Finley as his guy either, just trying to add the necessary depth you need for the quarterback spot in the SEC. If he wants to make this decision, he's going to be able to do that however he wants to. And as I said before, some of the things that has really kind of hurt Bo Nix at Auburn, I think, is related to some of the stuff that Malzahn has said about him in the past. I could play you the audio. Go back and listen to the ways in which Gus Malzahn said, "Oh yeah, we just think Bo Nix is going to win a championship while he's here." That's a hard thing to put on any quarterback, even the programs that are winning championships regularly. Alabama is winning championships regularly, but you don't hear Nick Saban or Bill O'Brien, the new offensive coordinator, saying, "Oh yeah, we think Bryce Young is going to come here and win a championship," even though it's certainly a more reasonable prediction to say that about Alabama and its starting quarterback because of how many championships Alabama seems to win. You don't tag a quarterback with that kind of burden in terms of expectations, but in the case of Malzahn, I do think he did that some with Nix. And given the recruiting credentials that Nix had, I think it kind of creates this toxic stew of any kind of subpar play all of a sudden is going to be more magnified because of how good Auburn fans thought that Nix was going to be. But ultimately, the real issue here for Auburn may not be who's the better quarterback between Nix and Finley, because frankly, neither guy may prove to be a great quarterback. Nix has had his issues at Auburn. Finley was beaten out for the job seemingly by Max Johnson at LSU. That's the reason why he's entering the transfer portal. Let's not forget that. So neither Finley nor Nix may be spectacular. The bigger issue is, and you better believe this is something we'll probably be watching a lot on SEC Country Live in upcoming weeks. The bigger issue is there a playmaker for whoever emerges as the Auburn starting quarterback? Is there a playmaker for that quarterback to throw to? A lot of big names are gone from Auburn. Seth Williams not there anymore. Eli Stove's not there anymore. Anthony Schwartz is not there anymore. Auburn being active in the transfer portal in the remainder of the summer to bring in a wide receiver is probably going to be one of those things that we're watching closely, because as it stands right now, I don't know that Auburn has that guy to help them keep pace offensively in the SEC. I do believe that Auburn will lean heavily on Tank Bigsby this year. And frankly, Bigsby may end up being the best friend of the quarterback who starts for Auburn, no matter who it ends up being. Bigsby may have that kind of value, but this is a different league than it once was. This is a league where you still got to be able to throw that ball. You've got to be able to move the ball down the field. You can't be, running game only anymore. But for now, whether it's Finley or Nix, there is a degree to which you're kind of left to wonder, does Auburn have anything else other than Tank Bigsby offensively? And that's going to be a big, big issue for offensive-minded head coach Brian Harsin and his new offensive coordinator Mike Bobo, who's been in a couple of different spots in the SEC, who seemingly knows this league well. That's going to be a big issue for those guys to address. Important offseason there for Auburn as Brian Harsin tries to keep pace with the rest of the SEC here. Our All Points Bulletin continues on SEC Country Live. We'll have more of your comments coming up in just a moment. Let me deal with some other news around the SEC before we get there. I thought it was interesting the other day that CBS Sports, over the course of a couple of different articles, ranked its top coaches in college football. And I'm going to show you on the screen here the SEC coaches, the 5 SEC coaches at the top of the list. And what you see next to their name is their national rank. So Nick Saban, maybe no surprise, coming in at number 1 on this list. Jimbo Fisher coming in at number 6, ahead of Kirby Smart there from Georgia, number 7. Smart falls a little bit. Dan Mullen comes in at number 10, ahead of Ed Orgeron there at LSU at number 11. Now, let me give you a couple of opinions on this. First of all, you'll move Nick Saban off to the side because as of right now, no one can really have any kind of beef with Saban being ranked number 1 overall, even though at this stage of his career, I actually think Steve Sarkisian was more important for Alabama's success a year ago than Saban probably was. The fact of the matter is he's got another national championship trophy. Alabama's recruiting at the level that's as high as it's ever recruited. You really can have not much in the way of complaining in regards to where to where Nick Saban is ranked right there. But do you have a beef if you're a Georgia fan with Kirby Smart being ranked below Jimbo Fisher? They've only met one time since both guys have been in the SEC. Smart as a head coach, Jimbo moving over from Florida State. Smart won that matchup head-to-head back in 2019. Jimbo, of course, has the nod, as we mentioned a moment ago. He is a one-time national championship winner, an active coach with a national championship. There aren't too many guys you can say that about. Jimbo Fisher is one of those guys, but is that enough right now to rank you ahead of Kirby Smart? I think if you're a Georgia fan, you can make a fairly substantial case that Smart ought to be rated ahead of Fisher, just given the fact that the other coaches on this list who were kind of in that sort of top 5 realm or top 10 realm, Smart has the 3 head-to-head wins against Dan Mullen, lost to him, of course, last year. Smart has beaten Lincoln Riley, another guy that kind of shows up in the top 5 of the 2017 Rose Bowl, beat him there, beat Jimbo Fisher in 2019. The only blemish, really, that Kirby Smart has is the fact that he has lost to Nick Saban 3 times since he's been a head coach. But if you're going to judge Kirby Smart because he hasn't quite yet gotten over the Nick Saban hump, then there are a lot of coaches that you can't rank very high because of that. But actually the argument that I feel the strongest about is probably not Smart behind Jimbo and the error there in my mind for CBS. The real error, I think, is ranking Dan Mullen ahead of Ed Orgeron. Let me ask you this. If you're a Florida fan, when you look at what Ed Orgeron has done at LSU, he's won a national championship. When you look at what he's likely to do over the course of the next 5 years, given the recruiting success that LSU typically enjoys, given how it's currently set up at the quarterback position, could anybody say that Florida's quarterback situation is deeper than what LSU's is, even though that's supposed to be the kind of thing that Dan Mullen is famous for? Mullen typically uses transfers to kind of round out his roster. LSU, for the most part, doesn't need to do that. Is there anybody who could legitimately say that either because of the past, what Mullen has accomplished in comparison to Orgeron, or the future, what Mullen is expected to do in comparison to what Ed Orgeron is expected to do, is there any argument whatsoever to be made for Dan Mullen ahead of Ed Orgeron? I'm honestly not quite so sure what it would be. It's certainly not head-to-head. Florida's lost the last 2 matchups there. I guess Florida did win the game in 2018. You can say, well, they played them relatively close in Baton Rouge in 2019, but honestly, this is not a show that gives much in the way of moral victories, close but no cigar scenarios. You don't even really have that head-to-head argument in your favor if you're trying to tout Dan Mullen over Ed Orgeron either. This is one of those kind of inexplicable points in this ranking of, how do you have Dan Mullen rated ahead of Ed Orgeron? I honestly don't understand it. I do want to point out 1 or 2 more kind of interesting things about this real quick, and obviously we'll get back to your comments here in just a little bit. So if you look a little farther down the list, go to like 22nd, 23rd on this list, you see another SEC coach show up in Mark Stoops at 22nd, rated 1 spot ahead of Jim Harbaugh at Michigan at 23rd. Now, understand, at this point, there is very little in the way of evidence to argue for Jim Harbaugh being ranked higher than that, better than that. His Michigan teams have grossly underperformed. Totally understand that. But go back to a few years ago when a list like this would be compiled. Could you ever imagine Harbaugh being rated so low and there be so little argument that he should be rated better? And a guy like Mark Stoops, who, even though there's some media people that seem to like Stoops as one of those guys that's capable of doing more with less, for the most part, he has no real profile amongst fans at all. The average college football fan could not pick Mark Stoops out of a lineup. He coaches Kentucky with very little fanfare, goes into Southern Ohio, finds some players, builds a tough physical football team, but for the most part is not a well-known figure around the sport of college football, and yet he's rated ahead of one spot in this case, one of the most now infamous guys in the sport, Jim Harbaugh, for being such a colossal failure at Michigan. I think that's a very, very interesting ranking to pay attention to. And then you look on the next page of the coaches rated outside the top 25, all the way down to the bottom 65. The 65th rated coach in college football is the brand new South Carolina coach Shane Beamer. Down there near the bottom as well, you have first and second year SEC coaches. Obviously Kiffin, who we talked about before, Mike Leach going into a second year at Mississippi State, Sam Pittman going into a second year, Eli Drinkwitz, who does have some experience at Appalachian State, so he's a little higher on the list. But when you think about these guys, first year Josh Heupel, first year Brian Harsin, first year Shane Beamer, first year Clark Lee, if anybody cares about him, I don't. Second year guys like Kiffin, Leach, Pittman, Drinkwitz. There's just not going to be room for all of these guys in the SEC. Somebody's success is going to take food off somebody else's table. So whether you want to kind of group them amongst the divisions, Drinkwitz, Beamer, Heupel still fighting to be employed 2 or 3 years from now, and the same thing about Kiffin, Leach, Pittman, Harsin, still just kind of fighting to hold on to their job in a league where somebody has to finish last. And I don't care what your excuse is, your fan base is going to brutalize you if you finish last in the SEC West. Or you can sort of group them as first-year guys, Harsin in comparison to Heupel and Beamer, especially that comparison because so much of what Harsin filled his coaching staff out with were guys that Shane Beamer thought he was going to be able to hire at South Carolina. You're going to put Drinkwitz with the other second-year guys, the Mississippi coaches and Sam Pittman. Once again, there's just not going to be room for everybody. So you like reality television, you like watching guys get voted off the island. There are some SEC coaches over the course of the next 24 months that are going to get voted off the island. There's only so many recruiting resources to go around. There'll never be enough good players in a league like this. There's only so many wins to be had, given the fact that you're also facing a team that's trying just as hard as you are. There's only so much of that takes place. Watching what happens with this kind of second half, bottom half group of SEC coaches, who survives for a couple of years, who sticks around for 5 years, who gets run out of town the next year or two. All of that is in play for that group right now, and I think all of that is pretty fascinating. SEC Country Live rolls on here. Our All Points Bulletin looking at the rest of the world of college football. And I want to mention this for a moment there as well. We talked about some gambling stuff off the top of the show. I like it when South Point, who's one of the big sports books in Las Vegas, when they share some of their point spreads for the upcoming year. And, this is one of those big deals. And for a while, it used to be like the Golden Nugget. They would want to do this first. And there's kind of an arms race to see who can get their preseason point spreads out the soonest. South Point has kind of leapt to the front of that line there on this. I'll show you this on the screen. I realize you won't be able to see this too well, but we're going to try to pay attention to a couple of these here. For instance, look at Ole Miss going to Alabama. For folks who remember Ole Miss keeping it close with Alabama a year ago, on Saturday, October the 2nd, when they go to Alabama for the revenge game there. Right now, Alabama stands as a 22-point favorite there in that game. How about LSU as a 2-point favorite against Auburn? Auburn actually gets a decent amount of love from South Point here because they're only a 2-point dog at LSU, even though they haven't won there since 1999. They're actually only a 4-point underdog against Georgia at home the following week in October, despite the fact that FanDuel has Auburn as like a 10-point underdog there in that game. We heard Stephen Lasson from Athlon Sports say a little earlier that he still sees a gap between Alabama and Texas A&M. Apparently the South Point Sportsbook does there as well. They've got Bama as a 10-point road favorite there. Connor Riley, who's producing us today, was saying if you look at the SEC schedule, by the way, the CBS folks did come out with their schedule announcements here, at least some of their games for the upcoming year. He says it kind of sets up for Alabama and A&M to be kind of a primetime game for CBS. That'd be a tough spot for A&M not to play well, just given the hype they've had this offseason. Right now, though, Vegas still sees Bama as a 10-point favorite there in that game. I've told you before, I'm watching Arkansas very closely against Texas. Right now, according to South Point, Longhorns just a 3-point field goal favorite on the road there at Arkansas. That is a game that I could see being an upset type situation. They're very, very interested in what happens there. If you care about Egg Bowl, Ole Miss a 7-point favorite at Mississippi State right now. I'm not high on Mississippi State at all. So good stuff there from the South Point Sportsbook as they kind of look at some of those big lines, point spreads for the upcoming year. And, boy, it's going to be here before you know it. And I'm excited to see all this kind of stuff coming out. As Stephen Lassen said, we're kind of in that scenario where we're doing a lot of things this year that we just didn't know we could do last year because we weren't sure for 100% sure we were going to have a season. Well, now we know right now the world's heading for a healthier and safer place, full stadiums, good times, point spreads, preseason magazines, and everything that goes along with that. That's a really exciting thing to be able to see. We'll have a fun SEC LOL in just a minute here. Let us take some comments for you before we get there. Tennille Calvino, good to see you checking in. Moose Tame says, please don't end at 4. We will end at 4 today, but we'll be back next Wednesday there as well. I'm glad you're having a good time with that. Charlie Adams also weighs in to say this coaching ranking thing is odd. As far as Coach O being behind Mullen might be a reflection of the two coaches' collective careers. Mullen led Mississippi State to heights they've never been. Coach O has one great year and a dud last season. I guess the only thing I'll say about that, though, is when it's all said and done, I mean, what is the real significant accomplishment for Dan Mullen at Mississippi State? He was briefly ranked number 1 in the country, but they didn't really finish there. And I'd argue even prior to Joe Burrow at LSU, I think the Orgeron coaching career has been a little bit misunderstood. Take the Ole Miss years out of it. That was obviously not a good time for Orgeron. The truth is, a lot of folks think he got a raw deal at USC. And go back and look at LSU in 2018, before Joe Brady arrived, before Joe Burrow really got it cooking. The truth is, LSU was handling its business against most teams that year, with the exception, obviously, of Alabama. But, I would say that there's more to the Orgeron coaching, history than just the 2019 season. Jerry Popham says, my revenge game for 2021 is, of course, Jerry's a Georgia fan. He says against he's having some fun with Vanderbilt's name here. Obviously, there are a lot of folks who are Georgia fans who are not happy with Vanderbilt because Vanderbilt canceled Georgia's game a year ago, and Jerry, amongst a lot of Georgia fans, looking for some revenge on that. Tennille Calvino checking in. Nice to see Tennille here as well. A lot of good comments coming in. Also, more from Deontay Julian. He's checking in with some good comments there as well. Let's go back over to YouTube. We'll get some comments over there, too. Silent Chaos asking, we heard from our buddy G. Grace, Bama boy, an Alabama fan a little earlier, about what he thinks about quarterback room. Silent Chaos making a case for the Georgia quarterback room right now. And this is one of those things where, the Georgia quarterback play has not been as good as national championship teams should be on the field the last couple of years. JT Daniels certainly seemed to be changing that near the end of last year. And as Silent Chaos points out, there's also some hope amongst Georgia fans that this is about to change as Georgia heads into the upcoming season because of Carson Beck, a 4-star signee who's kind of generated some buzz during the spring. Brock Vandagriff, former 5-star signee, who's also kind of waiting the wings, looking to compete for playing time. Stetson Bennett's still there. Bennett started games a year ago. So there's some Georgia fans who feel better about the just the overall depth of the Georgia quarterback situation. Foster Moss, thank you for the kind words. Appreciate that. DJ Jammin' Star said Harbaugh 23rd on the CBS list. It should actually be even lower than that. I'm sure a lot of folks probably agree with that. Memphis Dog kind of says the same thing there. That's kind of funny to see. Jay Shipe says Bo Nix didn't get too many plays where he had the line contained long enough to set his feet. Yeah, he's had issues with offensive line play there at Auburn. I won't deny that. And I guess I haven't completely given up on the idea that Bo Nix can still be a serviceable quarterback. I think some of the grief that he's gotten at Auburn has probably been unfair. I mean, this is still the guy. I don't want to make too big of a deal about one throw, but this is still a guy who makes a big touchdown throw to beat Oregon to start the season back in 2019, which certainly seems like a long time ago now. But if you can do that then in your first college game, the chance still exists that you could do more than that, here in a year like 2021. I'm certainly not predicting it to happen, but I'm also not completely giving up on the idea that Bo Nix could still have some success there. Mark Morris says he thinks that Jimbo Fisher, Mark lives in Florida, so he has a little bit of insight on this, will be forever tainted by the Florida State dumpster fire he reigned over his last year there. And, Mark, you may be right about that. I still sort of think that story has not been properly told in terms of what Florida State, the institution, the athletic department, the role they played in their own dumpster fire there. I think a lot of the Florida State spin on the departure of Jimbo Fisher was conveniently portrayed to blame a lot of stuff on Fisher on his way out the door there. But Florida State's a team, an organization, a program that has not always shown full commitment to winning, resources for that you need for that. Florida State kind of has the feel of a big-time program because of the success they enjoyed with Bobby Bowden there in the 90s and into the 2000s. But, boy, some of the ways in which they operate would make it very difficult to remember just how good they once were. A couple more comments here, and then we'll get ready to go. Alan Verbanchik checking in. Good to see him there as well. Moose Thames also says that, from 2018 to 2020 in the SEC has to be the biggest span of new coaches ever. And, it's one of those predictions that, listen, a lot of us get predictions wrong, and this was one that some folks got wrong. That because of the pandemic a year ago, that was going to prevent a lot of programs from making those coaching changes moving into 2021, but that clearly was not the case, as Auburn, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, South Carolina all chose to spend big on buyouts and move on from their expensive head coaches. And so clearly the appetite to win in the SEC is not lessened just because of a global pandemic. Really good comments on the show today. Appreciate you being a part of that. We always like to kind of finish off on a light note around here, and so we'll do that with our SEC LOL. This is not quite SEC related, although there are a lot of SEC fans who are also golf fans. But this certainly will bring the laughs out. Have you seen the video yet? I'm sure you probably have, of Brooks Koepka reacting in frustration when Bryson DeChambeau, a golfer that Brooks does not like, walked behind him after an interview with the Golf Channel at the PGA Championship at Kiawah Island this past weekend. And it's kind of become a meme here with the closed eyes of Koepka acting frustrated. This has been kind of appropriated in a bunch of different ways here, including by Tom Brady, who's really, to be a, sort of goatish all-time great type player, is actually pretty active on Twitter. And so he kind of mocks Aaron Rodgers here. Rodgers is the closed eyes Brooks Koepka. The Packers kicking a field goal down 7 is the irritating Bryson DeChambeau, which is really funny. This is also probably cross-promotion as well. Didn't it come out today that Brady and Rodgers are going to do a match against, is it Phil Mickelson and is it DeChambeau's the other guy there? So, yeah, a little bit of cross-promotion here for Brady, but we're not mad about that either. Pretty fun stuff there. That is our SEC LOL for today. Thank you so much for being here on SEC Country Live. We'll be back here again next Wednesday at 3 p.m. So please tell folks we're talking SEC. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for making it fun for me. Y'all enjoy the rest of this summer here. We're rolling through what's going to be a fascinating season around the SEC later on this fall. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be able to talk about that with you. We'll see you next Wednesday, 3 p.m. for SEC Country Live. We'll look forward to talking to you then.